Welcome, everyone, to another question and answer session. My name is Samara Belitzky. I'm an employment lawyer at Samfiru, Tumarkin. I work out of our firm's Ottawa office, but I assist clients all throughout Ontario. I'll be here this afternoon to answer all of your questions. I'll be here for about 30 minutes. So if you have any questions at all regarding your workplace issues, employment, severance, COVID vaccine mandates, unpaid leaves related to those mandates, layoffs, whatever the case may be, any issues that you're having in the workplace, if it's you, if it's someone you know, whatever the case may be, send in your question. Now is the time. I'm here, like I said, the next half an hour to answer all of your questions about all of these types of issues. And I'm happy to do so. I wanted to mention just at the beginning of this session, because we've been getting so many questions and so many calls and emails from people lately, mostly to do with a lot of the vaccine mandates that employers are putting in place. If we don't get to your question, please contact me directly or any of my colleagues, or contact our firm directly. You can go to our website, which is employmentlawyer.ca. And that website has all of our contact information. So you can find all of the lawyers' contact information there and our main firm contact information. And you can request assistance that way. So if, let's say, you're contacting our firm, it's been taking a few days for someone to get back to you. We do our very best to get back to people as soon as possible. Unfortunately, we have been inundated with calls from people experiencing these issues with COVID-19 vaccines. And so it's been a little bit longer than usual getting back to people. So if you are one of those people, you can reach out to me directly. You can reach out to any of my colleagues directly, and we would be happy to either direct your call or your email to the appropriate person or province, or assist you directly. And I actually had someone in the last session that I did a few weeks ago. I had someone mention that she was having trouble getting in touch. I had her reached out to me directly, and we're now assisting her moving forward and going to help her go after severance pay. So it really does make a difference in terms of contacting us if you find yourself in a situation where you've been put on an unpaid leave or your employment has been terminated outright without cause or for cause, which is some of the terminations that we're seeing. If that's the case, definitely get in touch with us. Don't wait. We'd be happy to assist you. And we are trying to get back to everyone as quickly as we possibly can. So please don't be shy to reach out to me directly or any of my colleagues so that we can definitely, assist you with these issues, because time is of the essence. So we're starting to get some questions coming in here. So I'll move to the questions, and then I'll get back to some other topics that I wanted to mention if we have time to get to them. Lately, we've been just spending the whole 30 minutes answering your questions simply because we've had so many of them. So send your questions in now. I'm happy to answer them. So I have a question from Dean on YouTube who says, it sounds like lots of companies are adding a new rule, hiring only vaccinated. Is it legal to do this? Not referring to federally mandated places. So that's a very good question. It's one that we've been getting a lot. In terms of there being a requirement to be vaccinated in order to be hired, as of today, the law does not prohibit an employer from doing that as long as they're accommodating human rights issues. And what I mean by that is, if, for example, there's a medical condition or a religion at play that would prohibit or prevent somebody from being vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine, which is what I assume you're talking about, Dean, then the employer or the potential employer would have to accommodate that need, would have to provide an accommodation for those issues under the Human Rights Code. So there are exceptions to that, absolutely, and that is one of them. The medical accommodation or a religious accommodation or a creed accommodation is another name that goes by. So that is something that employers have to look at very carefully and have to comply with. And then there are other exceptions to that as well, depending on the sector. So in general, an accommodation needs to be provided. I have another question here from YouTube from Bonnie, who says, my union said at the point they think they will not win, would it be worth hiring a lawyer to take a second look? So this is a question that we've been getting a lot lately because most of the unions are in support of the COVID-19 vaccine mandates. And so most people who are unionized are having issues with their union agreeing to file a grievance, for example, on their behalf. The challenges, and I mentioned this in the last session that we did because we got a lot of questions from unionized employees. The challenges as a unionized employee, you have to go through your union. You don't have the ability to, for example, sue your employer in court and hire a lawyer and go after them in court. You're actually stuck with your union for better or for worse, depending on the scenario. And so if you're in a situation where you are faced with a vaccine mandate, you don't want to be vaccinated, and your union has considered the issue, but is choosing not to file a grievance, unfortunately, you are stuck with that result. Now, lawyers can definitely give you advice. If you're unionized and you're looking for some advice on your situation, certainly you can have a consultation with a lawyer and we can give you advice on your situation. We can give you a recommendation. We can let you know what your options are. But we can't actually represent you and, for example, sue your employer in court on your behalf. And so, unfortunately, you are stuck a little bit between a rock and a hard place if you are in a situation where your union is not supporting you. The union does have an obligation to at least consider filing a grievance, to at least turn their mind to the issue. But beyond that, they don't actually have a legal obligation to file a grievance. Some unions are, but from what I hear from the people that contact us, most are not. And so in terms of whether it's worth your while to speak to a lawyer, that's really a personal choice that only you can make. If it gives you peace of mind, if you want to do your due diligence, speak to a lawyer and get some, impartial, objective advice, certainly you can do that. And we would be happy to assist you and give you advice. But you'd have to keep in mind that that would be just a consultation with any lawyer, and that we wouldn't be able to actually represent you and do very much for you in terms of action. So I hope that answers your question, Bonnie. I have another question here from Valeria on YouTube. Valeria says, hi, Samara. I am wondering if we pursue a severance package after being put on unpaid leave with no end date, will the employer be able to change their mind to avoid paying the severance pay? So that's a very good question, and one that we're getting a lot. There are lots of people who've been put on unpaid leave as a result of refusing to be vaccinated in the face of a vaccine policy or a vaccine mandate in the workplace. So the first thing I should mention is, if you're in an industry where the government has mandated it by law that you have to be vaccinated in order to continue working, the following advice does not apply to you. So if you're in an unfortunate situation where you have to have the vaccine in order to keep your job, in order to keep working, there won't be very much that anyone can do for you. There won't be much that we can do to assist you. If, for example, in Ontario, you work at a long-term care home, or you work for the federal government, for example, the core public administration. So those are situations where, unfortunately, we cannot assist you. But for most people who don't fit into those categories, if you're put on an unpaid leave because of this new policy that you have refused to comply with because you don't want to be vaccinated, that's a situation where you don't have to accept that leave. So if you're put on unpaid leave, your employer has stopped paying you, they're preventing you from working, it's what we call a constructive dismissal, because your employer is not outright telling you you're fired, but the end result is the same because you're not working and you're not getting paid. And so you don't have to accept that unpaid leave. You can treat it like a constructive dismissal, like a termination of your employment, and you can pursue severance pay. Now, in terms of your question, Valeria, about can the employer change their mind to avoid paying the severance pay? The answer is it depends. It's a very lawyerly answer. It does depend on the situation. So an employer, when faced with somebody who is asserting a claim of constructive dismissal, can say, okay, we'll have you come back to work return to work, all the same terms and conditions. And if the employer does that, and it's all of the same exact terms and conditions of before, that doesn't mean you have to go back. And it doesn't mean that it's not a constructive dismissal. What it means is that there is a possibility that it may limit how much severance you're owed. That's the difference. So they cannot avoid paying severance pay in a situation like that. It's not a matter of avoiding. It's a question of limiting their liability to how much severance you might be owed. So that's something that's important to keep in mind, but that would not be the reason why you shouldn't pursue it, because for most people that we're speaking to, these unpaid leaves have no end date in sight. They can go on and on and on and on, and you're sitting there not getting paid, you're out of work. And so in most of these situations, you should be pursuing severance pay and moving forward. And in the vast majority of cases, the employer is not likely going to be recalling you back to work because you're still not vaccinated. And the whole reason that they've put you on leave to begin with is your refusal to be vaccinated. So very low risk of that happening, but even if it did, it's not likely going to have much of an impact on the case. Okay, we'll get to some of your other questions here. Question from Carrie on Facebook. Carrie, contact me directly. Go on our website, employmentlawyer.ca. Once you're on our website, you can go to our page called our team, where all of our lawyers are listed. If you're in Ontario, Carrie, I'm happy to assist you. Send me an email, click on my profile, and you'll see my email is there. Send me an email this afternoon, and we can go from there. If you're not in Ontario, I can direct you to one of my colleagues in BC or in Alberta, depending on the situation. So just look up my information on our website and send me an email directly, and I'll be more than happy to help you. Just scrolling through your questions here. I have a question from someone who calls themselves the Dreamer on YouTube, who says, I work for a private security company. We are contracted to provincial and federal sites. Clients for those sites have a vaccine mandate or testing. Are we bound by the government to get one? This is also a question we've been getting a lot, and it really depends on the circumstances. So how this issue works is, if it is a third party that is putting in a mandatory vaccine policy or a vaccine mandate, and your job is with that third party, even though you're employed by your employer, you have to have access to the third party workplace in order to work. And your employer is not put in the vaccine mandate, but the third party has. That's a situation where there would be what we call frustration, because it's no fault of yours, no fault of your employer's, but because of the action of a third party, which is out of the employer and the employee's control, you're not able to work. So it's not a situation where you would be owed severance necessarily, because it's a frustration of contract. And so what I have been seeing in situations like that is the employer, usually of good faith, is opting to put someone like yourself on unpaid leave for the time being to see where this goes, rather than claim frustration and have your employment terminated. Because if they're put on an unpaid leave in a situation where you wouldn't be owed severance, for example, then at least you have options. You can wait it out, and maybe when the vaccine mandates are removed, you'd be able to keep working. So a lot of employers who kind of have their hands tied in those situations are opting for the unpaid leave so that there are options moving forward. Now, in terms of the government, if it's a federal government site, absolutely, as a contractor, the federal government has changed the law such that all contractors at workplaces of the core public administration would have to be vaccinated in order to work. So again, that's the government coming in and changing it, and it's a third party getting involved and essentially making it such that your employer's hands are tied. An exception to that would be if your employer has other work. So if you can work somewhere where there's a vaccine mandate and you can't work there because you're not vaccinated, if there are other contracts, if there is other work available where a vaccine mandate doesn't have to be is not in place or doesn't have to be followed, whatever the case may be, then that does open up possibilities where the employer can and should be looking to accommodate by putting you in different roles. And it can be a different position potentially because it's an accommodation. The employer can offer options. It's not something that you necessarily have to accept as an employee, and it will always depend on the exact circumstances of what's being offered. But in situations like that, it is something that you can explore. And if you are in a situation like that, which is not something that is super common, but we have heard from some people in situations like that, especially in security companies where there is a lot of government work, but there's also private sector work, then they should be looking for other private sector work for you. Or if, let's say, you work on 3 contracts, one of them is a government contract where there's a mandate, the other 2 are not, you should be continuing to work in those other 2 jobs. If your only job is the government job or posted at a government facility, unfortunately, that's where there's going to be a frustration situation. I have a question here from Mark on YouTube who asks if the government has said non-compete clauses in contracts are no longer allowed. Does that mean if I signed a contract 2 years ago with a non-compete that it is no longer valid? So the legislation hasn't been enacted yet, so we'll have to see exactly what it looks like when and if it comes into place. But usually it wouldn't be retroactive. It would usually be an application moving forward, which means that the legislation itself wouldn't invalidate the non-compete clause in your contract. But very importantly, most non-compete and non-competition clauses are already unenforceable. So there is a very, very high likelihood, Mark, that in your contract, that non-compete is already invalid and it's already unenforceable because there are very, very strict rules for non-competition clauses because when a company is restricting an individual's ability to find gainful employment by going to work for a competitor, for example, the court puts very, very strict rules on that. And it has to be limited in time, in geographic location, and in scope. Those are the 3 main restrictions that need to be put on it. So it cannot be overly broad or unreasonable when it comes to the scope. So in other words, the sector that it applies to, the location. So for example, if it's all of Canada, that's a problem. That's overly broad. And the time, it can't be 5 years. It has to be a reasonable time frame. Most non-competition clauses that we see are not reasonable and are overly broad, which means that a court would strike it down. They wouldn't be found to be enforceable because they're usually for too long and for too broad a geographic location, and even the scope sometimes is too large. So that's something that is important to keep in mind, Mark. If you're not sure, you want to have that reviewed, get in touch with me or any of my colleagues. We'd be happy to take a look at that for you and let you know one way or the other whether it's valid. You can find my contact information on employmentlawyer.ca. But like I said, the odds are it's not valid. If you want to be extra sure, get it reviewed by an employment lawyer to be sure where you stand, especially if you're looking at going to a competitor and competing with the employer that had you sign it. So you just want to make sure that you protect yourself in advance so you hopefully don't have any problems later on. I have another question from the Dreamer on YouTube. If you've been put on an unpaid leave, again, with the caveat of what we talked about, if there is a mandate in place, then the employer's hands are tied. But if you are on an unpaid leave and there isn't a mandatory vaccine policy, certainly you can look at it as a constructive dismissal, as I mentioned earlier, and pursue severance. In terms of your question about testing, you say you want to do testing, but you don't know how to do that, and you've reached out to your employer. If there is an option for testing, that's great. If there isn't, and your employer is actually putting a mandatory vaccine policy in place, I suggest that you email your employer and make it very clear to them that you are willing to do rapid antigen testing at the employer's expense, and that you'd be pleased to do that in order to continue working without being on a leave. And that way, if your employer responds to you and says, no, the only option is vaccine or that's it, then you're in a much stronger position to pursue a constructive dismissal claim, again, assuming that you're not in a situation where there is frustration because of the third party having the vaccine mandate in place. So I have a question here from Kim on YouTube who says, while suspended without pay, are you entitled to your benefit, medical and dental, and any other benefits that generally come with your employment? So it depends on the circumstances. Most of the unpaid leaves that we're seeing, if you're talking about a suspension without pay, that would be an unpaid leave related to the refusal to be vaccinated. Usually what we're seeing is the employers are offering for the employee to have their benefits continued if you continue to pay your portion of it. I have seen cases where the employer pays for 100% of the benefits and decides not to continue that and offers the employee the option to pay for it themselves in order to continue the coverage. So there are a few different scenarios that we're seeing come up. Technically, they don't have to because you're on an unpaid leave. So you're not actively working. And if your employer is terminating your benefits while you're on an unpaid leave, it's even more so an indication that there is a constructive dismissal argument there if you wanted to treat that like a termination and not accept the unpaid leave. And so it goes to what we were discussing just a little bit earlier, which is if the employer stops paying you, and that can include your benefits, you don't have to accept that. You can treat it like a constructive dismissal and go after your severance pay. And that's something that we have been doing on behalf of our clients in this exact situation over the last few weeks. And I expect that we will be continuing to do that for the foreseeable future as these issues continue to come up. So I have a question here from Average Joe on YouTube who asks, can an American company in Canada force you to take the vaccine? They are doing so in our American headquarters since they have US government federal contracts. I work from home if that matters. So there wouldn't be a mandate in Canada. So in other words, the US can't mandate vaccination within Canada. Only Canada can do that within Canada. So I'm not sure which province you're in, but whatever province you're in, there can be provincial mandates, there can be federal mandates where the federal government comes in and makes mandates throughout the entire country for certain sectors like they have already. But the fact that it's an American company that you work for and they happen to be mandated in their US office is not something that's going to affect you in Canada if you're working in Canada. If, let's say, you were working in the US, it would be a different story. So they can't mandate it. And to be clear, regardless of an American company, a Canadian company, no company or employer can force you to get vaccinated. There is no such thing as a company forcing you to be vaccinated. They can tell you that you're going to lose your job if you don't get vaccinated, and then you have a choice to make. It's obviously a very tough choice, and it may feel like you have no choice because of your options. But at the end of the day, nobody can force you to be vaccinated. So if you're in Canada and they are implementing a vaccine mandate with the kind of justification that this is what the case is in the US and they're mandated in the US, that's not going to fly here in terms of there being an actual mandate by the government. It would have to be the Canadian government. If they're implementing a vaccine mandate nonetheless, like lots of employers we've seen in the private sector, there are options. If you're not going to be vaccinated in light of a vaccine policy, they may put you on an unpaid leave. They may terminate your employment. So you have to be prepared that you may end up losing your job over this issue. And as long as you're prepared to deal with that issue, you have options once these things occur. If you are put on an unpaid leave or you are terminated, then you get in touch with us right away, and we can certainly assist you in going after severance. But that would have to happen first in order for you to have that legal recourse that you could pursue. I see, just as a follow-up, Average Joe, you said you're getting a medical exemption due to previous vaccine injuries from your doctor. So certainly you can try an accommodation. So we've talked about this at length in many of our videos and our sessions, which is, if you suffer from a medical condition that prevents you from being vaccinated, certainly you can request an accommodation and try to get an accommodation that way. It is difficult from what I've seen, simply because the government has come out with very narrow exemptions for medical accommodations. In essence, you'd have to be allergic to a component of the vaccine, which would be confirmed by an allergist or an immunologist. So because there are such narrow exemptions, a lot of employers are refusing many legitimate medical accommodations that are being requested. So that's kind of an added layer to this issue. And if you are in a situation where it's not an allergy, but your doctor is telling you that you should not be vaccinated for a medical reason, you should absolutely be putting that in a letter. Get your doctor to write a note or a letter, provide that to your employer, and request the accommodation. If your employer refuses to accommodate you and you end up on unpaid leave or you end up terminated, that's an extra issue. So not only would you be entitled to severance in a situation like that, but there would be a human rights issue there as well, excuse me, where you would be looking at a potential human rights claim and human rights damages for their failure to accommodate you. So that's something that we would have to look at a little closer, because human rights issues are very fact dependent, fact specific. So you'd have to really look at each case and its circumstances in order to see exactly what is owed, in your particular circumstances. But certainly that's the process to follow in order to make sure that you're in the strongest position possible to potentially go after these kinds of damages in the future if your employer refuses to accommodate a medical request. I have a question here from Maranatha on YouTube, who says that they're not unionized and will be put on unpaid leave on the 15th. My employer said that they will look at human rights and medical exemptions as an accommodation. What route via human rights should I pursue? So this is really tied into what I was just talking about, which is the medical exemption. So if you have an allergy to a component in the vaccine, that's already recognized, absolutely. Otherwise, from a legal perspective, there are other accommodations that might be required for other medical issues. And so if you have a doctor that is telling you that you cannot be vaccinated due to a medical condition, that's where you have to pursue that and provide that documentation to the employer. Now, there is no guarantee that they'll accept it. They may refuse it, and you may end up, as I said before, on an unpaid leave, or you may end up terminated. We can deal with that after the fact. Unfortunately, you can't prevent that from happening. You can try your best, but you can't prevent it from happening. But we can certainly assist you in dealing with it after the fact and going after the damages that would be owed to you. So I cannot tell you, what you should pursue in terms of a medical condition. If you have a medical condition that your doctor is supportive of and provides a note, that certainly is a path you can take. But if it's not successful and you end up in a situation where you're on unpaid leave or you're terminated, get in touch with us right away and we'll be happy to help you. So we're just at the end of our time here today. I have a few more questions. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get to, but as I mentioned earlier on in this session, if I don't get to your questions, contact us directly. You can email me, go to employmentlawyer.ca, and you can find all of our contact information, my information, all of my colleagues' information, and you can contact us directly. Or you can also email help@employmentlawyer.ca to get to our general email where somebody will get back to you. So if you're in a situation where I haven't gotten to your question, or you've contacted our firm and we haven't been able to get back to you yet, contact me directly or contact any of my colleagues directly, and we would be more than happy to assist you. Otherwise, there will be more question and answer sessions next week, at least a few, so you can tune into those and hopefully have your questions answered during that time. So thank you everyone very much for joining us, and we will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.